Hi, everyone. This is Don Davis, your host of Supply Chain Secrets. And for this episode, we're talking to Steve Statler, and he is an expert on the Internet of Things and also sustainability. And he was on to talk about the cold chain and how the Internet of Things is evolving in that space. He gave a little bit about his background and how that fits into what he's doing. And then he talked a little bit about the history of cold chain and some of the challenges there. Um, we talked about how it's been changing, how it changed in the past, and what it looks like in the future. And we talk about how we can create efficiency and eliminate waste through the Internet of Things and through the Internet of Things of cold chain. So I thought it was a really interesting show. And then at the end, we always wrap up. Steve is a fellow podcaster, so it felt very natural for him to ask me questions. Asked me a pretty tough question there at the end, actually. I was not prepared for that. But anyway, I think I did okay. But anyway, it was a lot of fun on that show. And if you want to be a guest like Steve, feel free to reach out and ping us. We get people DMing us all the time about coming on the show. We're totally open to that. So if you're listening and like, hey, this sounds like a lot of fun, I want to be on that show, reach out to us. And for women specifically, we're going to have another women shipping episode. So we got a lot of great feedback online. It was reshared a bunch of times and a lot of activity. So we're going to do that again. And we're going to do that again this quarter. So if you're listening and you're interested, reach out to us. Would love to have you on a show. And we'd love to talk about supply chain and interesting things like this show. So I think you'll like it. And don't forget, give us feedback, send us DMs, like us on social media. It's all very helpful to us because then that gives us the motivation to keep the podcast going. So give this one a listen. I think you'll like the show.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Brian Most and Don Davis.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Supply Chain Secrets. I'm Don Davis, your host, and I am the current Senior Vice President of NVO Experience at NYSHEX, and I'm a former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM. Today, we have a guest who is quite accomplished, I must say. His name is Steve Statler, and he is an expert on the Internet of Things and sustainability. He's also a podcaster like myself, so this show is going to be incredible when you put two podcasters together, but the Mr. Beacon podcast. He's also an author of Beacon Systems and the Senior Vice President of Amazon-backed Wiliot, who is in a partnership, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit today. But Steve, welcome to the show.
Hey there, Don. It's a real privilege to be on your podcast. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, great. So why don't you, I shed a few points there about your background, but maybe talk a little bit about, what you've been doing and what you've done. What was the path to get there?
Oh, well, I guess I first came across the IoT technology that we're talking about 10 years ago when I worked at Qualcomm. So very large semiconductor company, and we were looking at opportunities in IoT, and we discovered this thing called the Bluetooth beacon round about the same time that Apple did, and we ended up developing a business around it, and we developed these Bluetooth beacons that went in all of the Apple stores around the United States, and basically their job was to talk to the Apple shopping app to tell them whether you had crossed the threshold into the store. A very simple use case, but it replaced GPS, which in the past had told you whether you were in the car park, but they couldn't really tell whether you were going into the store or not. So that was all about Bluetooth and IoT focused on places. And now that same technology has evolved. It's got smaller, more affordable. And so rather than just tagging places, now we're tagging things. And through a very circuitous route, writing the Beacon Technologies book and the podcast, and I ended up doing a lot of consulting. I found this Israeli company. They showed up to one of my courses, and at the end of this one day of talking about Bluetooth beacon technology, this Israeli guy came to me and said, "Oh, we're thinking of developing a product that will be passive Bluetooth." And I kind of looked at him. I'd written a book. I'd spent a day pontificating about Bluetooth technology, and I had no idea what passive Bluetooth was. But essentially, it was battery-free Bluetooth. And at the time, This was about 4 years ago now, just over 4 years ago. It was a concept, and they just raised about $10 million based on a business plan the size of a napkin, based on the previous company they had, which pioneered millimeter wave, which is the thing that makes 5G faster than 4G. And it seemed outlandish. And I actually kind of discouraged Tal, the gentleman in question, and said I didn't think I could really help. But long story short, I ended up consulting for them. And 5 years later, they're now producing these tiny postage stamp sized computers, which have an ARM processor. They power themselves without batteries, as he promised, and they harvest and recycle Bluetooth energy and other energy. And they can not only deliver a unique ID and be kind of an anchor to the cloud between physical goods and cloud systems, but they can sense temperature, and so they can deliver cold chain information, and really revolutionize the visibility that we have on supply chains, which is something we need in this time where supply chains are so fragile and under such stress.
Yeah, sure. That's really, really cool. And maybe for our listeners, it might be helpful if you could give a definition of two things, because I'm not sure everybody understands when you talk about the Internet of Things, like what is that, or IoT, that people may not
Yes.
understand what that is. And also it might be helpful to talk about what cold chain is, just to kind of set the stage as we dig into those topics.
Yeah. So IoT, we all got to know the internet through the browser, and basically the connection was between the people in their browser and all of the servers around the world. But then we realized, well, things could be connected to the internet as well. And so we started with big, expensive things. And so IoT has really been the internet of expensive things, things like cars and gas meters and appliances. You buy a fridge, you buy a washing machine. It generally has Wi-Fi on it and Bluetooth as well. And you can now start warming your oven remotely. And the gas man no longer knocks on your door and gets chased around the backyard by your dog. They're reading these things remotely. And of course, more and more of our cars are now connected. And this has been revolutionary. But where IoT is going is to the next level. We're kind of double clicking and getting a new level of fidelity and going beyond the internet of expensive things to the internet of everyday things. Everyday things can mean different things to different people, but what we're talking about is clothing and food containers and pallets and plastic crates, medicine vials. So this is a vaccine vial. It's a vial of COVID vaccine, and you can just about see some traces of the copper antenna in this label. But this is connected to the Internet of Things, and it can measure the temperature, whether this vaccine has been diluted, and also how full it is. So when you start connecting everyday things to the internet, in this case it's using a Wiliot chip and the Wiliot cloud, but it gives you opportunities to do things that were never possible before. And we've kind of got used to a world where things are out of stock, there's huge amounts of waste, the quality of the produce that we buy is variable. I mean, is there anyone who's not bought a punnet of strawberries, as we would say in England, got them home and found that they're rotten? And then that shouldn't happen, and it doesn't need to happen when you start connecting things to the internet. So basically, the Internet of Things is you take the human out of it, you connect the asset to the internet, and that can be through a variety of technologies. Wiliot uses Bluetooth, but there's a whole cornucopia of wireless technologies that can be used to connect things to the cloud. So that's IoT. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah,
for the
absolutely.
first definition?
No, I think that was a great explanation, and I think for our listeners, it's probably very provocative to start to think about, because when you look at like things in the container shipping industry, historically, data has been really hard to come by, and there's so many milestones that either don't show up or come in late or come in, out of sequence, that it can be frustrating for people who want visibility. Now, I think the good news is that the industry is changing quite a bit. Long way to go. But when you show me a vial of COVID vaccine and say like, hey, this is this Internet of Things right here, we can track this. And then you think about, well, I have a container that's 40 feet long that came from Shanghai and I have no idea where it is. There seems like there's a lot of opportunity there. So it's exciting that this is becoming more
Huge.
common. But no, I think that definition was super helpful.
Well, I think, it excites me. I deal with this stuff every day, and I still get goosebumps when I start to think about what this could mean to the world and climate change and business models and just prosperity generally, because we're living in a world where there's just huge amounts of waste, huge amounts of inefficiency, and if you take climate change as one of our biggest problems. And we get presented with it as this Hobson's choice of a kind of a win-lose scenario. But I really see this technology as enabling a win-win where you start to eliminate waste and make the supply chain more efficient. And that is incredibly profitable. Customers will be delighted. The companies that lean into this and start instrumenting beyond knowing where the container is, but knowing what's in the container and where it is and where it's been, the opportunities for profit are massive. And that's the thing as an environmentalist, and I'm a bit of a tree hugger. I spend a bunch of time on projects that we probably won't have time to go into around carbon offsetting and making travel more carbon efficient. But it gives me hope that this world may not be headed for disaster, because when profit and planet and people are all aligned, then I think we can really solve huge problems. Like 40% of food goes to waste before it even gets to our refrigerator. And that's a profit issue, but it's a huge planet issue. And if we can eliminate that, you're talking like, 10% of our carbon footprint problem can be addressed. And we're really starting to work on that by focusing on this thing called cold chain, which you alluded to earlier, where we're basically looking at the supply chain, but with a temperature dimension overlaid onto it. And it's cold chains typically focused on goods that they come in different kind of temperature bands, but you can have obviously things like this that can be shipped at cryogenic temperatures, and that's kind of one level of cold chain. You have frozen goods, the fish and meat products, and then you can just have produce, our strawberries, our zucchinis, and so forth. And so they each have different requirements. And the good news and the bad news is there's massive problems there, but that's a huge opportunity to make things better. And I think we can, and we're starting to do that.
Yeah, that when you're talking, Steve, I was thinking about that. You said 40% of food goes to waste, right? And that's just so impactful, because you think about there's people in the world that don't have enough to eat, that are starving, that can't get things, and you think about just this inefficiency problem and how, if you could solve that, how much benefit there is just from a global perspective. And so that's really exciting to hear about, because I think there's certainly a need. I mean, if almost half is waste, it's a pity, and I think we can do better. So if you could talk a little bit about cold chain and how is it operated historically? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I would say I'm an IoT veteran and a relatively new person in the cold chain space. But as my company Wiliot has come into it, what we've seen is there's pretty good acceptance and implementation of cold chain and temperature monitoring at a very coarse granular level. If we kind of, so containers, they have we have reefers and Very often, more and more of these are going online. It's not pervasive, but that was really kind of the status quo that we saw coming into this. What we're talking about is going down to the crate level, and in some cases the item level. So this is item level cold chain, and that is revolutionary. It's a new thing. And if I just to finish off the COVID story, so the way these vaccines are distributed, then it's the cold chain solution is by default is these containers that have multiple pizza box size trays of vaccine in, and you can afford to have an expensive tracker on that, something with GPS that is constantly monitoring and has very fine grain calibrated temperature sensing. And that's great. And that manages to kind of measure everything from the factory to maybe the clinic. But there's this whole other world. What happens when the pizza boxes come out of the cryogenic chamber and they go into the fridge? And what happens when these go out of the pizza box and they end up sitting on the clinician's table? And if that thing's been sitting there at room temperature for 30 minutes, it may no longer do its job. So you get your shot and you think you're vaccinated, but you're not. And then you get sick and bad things happen. So when we do our engagements, because this is all still very new, we talk about the treasure hunt where, we go in and we're not quite sure. We know that there's a problem, but no one really knows. And very often people don't want to admit where the problem is. So where we are at the moment is there's been a focus on the transport container and maybe the refrigeration unit. But no one really knows what's going on in 90% of the journey of the product. And we just announced, and we got a story it was the lead story in the Wall Street Journal's logistics section about Israel's largest retailer, a company called Shufersal. And they're, pervasive. You buy your groceries in Israel, then you're probably getting them from Shufersal. And they basically were interested in understanding what was happening in their cold chain, not just at the container level, but starting off in the field and tracking zucchinis and peppers and tomatoes from the field all the way to the store. And I won't talk about them specifically in terms of the problems that they have, but generally, and I am talking generally here, we've seen amazing issues that just no one knew existed. I mean, they had an inkling, but the long and the short of it is produce does not take the route that everyone hopes from the farm to the store. It normally takes twice as long as what a lot of people think it should be. And so that's bad. It means that the shelf life is shorter than it should be. But the upside is if you start to put these tiny trackers on plastic crates, pallets, and cases, and you can start to see the flow of the produce into like a packing shed in the farm. And what happens in a packing shed very often is there's waves of product, and rather than going first in, first out, you find that the first in goes at the back and then everything gets piled up and it's the last in, first out. When that happens, then maybe you've put an extra day of being exposed in a temperature controlled environment on this product that is getting older. And that doesn't just happen once. That can happen in the packing shed. It can happen in the cooler on the farm. It can happen in the distribution center. And then what we're seeing, and I'm actually thinking about an American customer of ours where, there were these shipping temperature controlled trucks. And it was just a wave of dysfunctionality with stuff that shouldn't have been frozen that was being frozen, stuff that was frozen, being frozen, but then being left on the store floor, defrosting before it then goes and is refrosted. it's a miracle that we're all still alive.
Well,
but but there's certainly a lot of things that we can fix if we go from container level down to case level and item level.
yeah, I had a number of thoughts there when you were talking because I have some experience dealing with refrigerated cargo. So in my past, I worked for when I worked at Hapag-Lloyd, I worked for their U.S. flag division, and they moved a bunch of reefers. And when they had the refrigerated containers, they had these recorders in there that recorded temperature along the journey. But it was just a thing kind of thrown on top of the unit there and didn't record it down to a unit level. And then if something went wrong, the whole container had to be devanned and inspected. And then they had to say, like, is this okay? And so on, because, it might have lost temperature for a certain amount of time. And those things would happen over the course of, 6 months or whatever. You would have a few of those cases, and then you would check it out. But it just seemed really inefficient because you only saw like part of the story, right? What happened in that container. And I think to your point, there's a lot of blind spots in the journey, and to have it down to a package level, now you can start to see, because in this story, you're talking about like, well, first of all, things are taking too long. They're taking these strange routes, which are inefficient. Okay, now it gets off the truck, but now it's in a warehouse. But guess what? It goes in a warehouse and it just gets buried. And now you can't see that unless, again, you're tracking it on a unit level. So I think that's pretty interesting. And knowing how complicated it was when we had these recorders, now this is, again, 10-ish, so 8-ish so years ago. But when they had these recorders, they had to be like plugged in and downloaded. And they were very basic, I would say, in terms of how you interacted with them. How does it work for this technology? Because it seems to me it's a lot more sophisticated, and you'd be able to access it differently, and the interface wouldn't be just this clunky download where you'd have this like weird printout.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in the past, a lot of this data was viewed after the fact. There was a temperature logger, and then at the end of the journey, you plugged it in, you downloaded, and then that's when you kind of saw the horror story, and you're like, oh, we must do better next time. But the way we see this technology being deployed is it actually is an operational part of managing the flow in real time of what's happening. So that crate is sitting back at the back of the packing shed, and we've seen other crates coming in and coming out. Then these are all cloud connected. And actually, we give away the technology that enables these tags to be made. And we just charge Wiliot's business model, even though they have amazing semiconductor designers, is to charge for the cloud. And the reason why we do that is that cloud can very quickly and easily be plugged in to systems that can generate a text message. So even if this farmer doesn't have like the NASA display system, he probably has a phone which can get a text message saying, hey, the FIFO's now become a LIFO. These crates have been there for too long, and the temperature's just gone over the threshold. So what we have is a set of cloud APIs, web services that are basically very URLs, simple ways of connecting software systems together. And we've even been developing a drag and drop interface that allows you to connect this cloud to ERP systems, messaging systems, workflow systems, existing systems. So, and the infrastructure that we use are things like Wi-Fi access points that already have Bluetooth in, and you have to dot some, typically, although this isn't always the case, you might want to supplement the source of radio energy. But, in the past with technologies like RFID, that might have been something that cost thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. But the kind of devices we use cost less than $100. And so for like $1,000, you could equip a store to read a lot of these signals. So it's using the fact that Bluetooth is pervasive, it's everywhere, it's very low cost. And it is using the cloud APIs that are kind of fairly standard now in the industry, so that we can start to join these systems up, and we can make this part of the process, so that if that crate is sitting on the floor of the store when it should have gone straight into a cooler, you can tell someone and have them do about it. So it's kind of giving agency to the product rather than making it a data analysis exercise after the fact.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think making it easy to consume makes it so much more attractive, right? If you start to say, wow, I'm going to get a text message that's telling me something is happening that I don't expect to happen with my product. I mean, that's so far advanced to like this whole thing of downloading that I was referring to earlier, that you have to pull it out, download it,
Yes.
and then, see what happened and say, oh, we have to do something. And it would seem to me, and going back to that point you made earlier about, there's 40% waste here. And if I use this type of technology, I'm going to have better visibility. It's going to be easier to consume. And I would think you would have a competitive advantage. So if I'm a company or a farmer or whomever that adopts this and I'm competing, I'm going to have a lot more efficiency, and it stands to reason profitability from being able to use this type of technology. Would you agree with that? I mean, have you seen that happening in the adoption process?
Yeah, for sure. I think, and ESG, more and more of these companies are being held to high standards in terms of sustainability. And this is something that goes beyond lip service. But we see, if we can put 2 days of shelf life onto perishable products, that means that you're wasting a lot less. The quality of the product. It just frustrates the heck out of me. I eat strawberries every day, and I'm combing San Diego trying to find a store that sells good strawberries that aren't going bad and taste good. And it's super hard to do that, and it makes me kind of want to do a sales call on our local grocery chains to try and get them to adopt this technology. There really isn't. There aren't a lot of losers in this. The big retailers who have got a lot of power over the supply chains are probably in the best place to adopt this, because the technology is relatively simple, but it's when you have multiple players that need to talk to each other, that's when it starts to get more complex. And the reason why this technology has still not gone mainstream with COVID is not technical. We had a really successful project. Everyone was delighted, a lot of high fives. But then you have to persuade thousands of different hospitals to do an IT project to link up their systems and participate. Fortunately, we have investors like PepsiCo, one of the largest food producers in the world. Companies like that have a lot of power to drive change in their supply chains. But it becomes, as much as anything, a process change, an organizational issue. And that's where really, this is probably not something where the director of supply chain has an idea, goes to a conference and decides they're going to do something. I mean, they may do that and they may then drive that change. But really, to capitalize on this technology, I think it's a CXO level, board level decision. And we definitely see that's where a lot of our projects are being driven, because you end up bringing new skills on board. If I'm in the clothing business, then technology to me is fabric and weaves and dye, and this is cloud and Bluetooth and cellular and that sort of thing. So maybe there's new skills that are needed, and also the core systems. Going hand in hand with this is serialization, where every product, rather than just being tracked at a SKU level, you have a unique ID, a digital birth certificate, the soul of the product, one of our partners calls it, that has to be tracked and monitored. And you don't have to do all of this, but to kind of realize the full potential, then it means your back-end systems need to know about every individual product. Again, you don't have to do that, But if you want to realize the full potential, then that's where people are headed. And the people that are really embracing this, the companies that are really embracing it, are going to those sorts of levels because we've been talking about saving waste, but there's all sorts of sales upside from this as well. We talk about moving to Netflix business models where companies go from selling DVDs to a cloud service, a SaaS business model. One of our partners in Japan worked with the Japanese government to put tags on bags of lettuce, and they were going from the store to the refrigerator to look at what's in your fridge. And if you're a grocery store player, let's imagine fast forward, you're no longer wasting all of this product. You've got another 2 days of shelf life. Where do I go from there? Well, the future is direct engagement and intimacy with the end customer, where you start to know what's in their fridge, and you can have auto replenishment services. Oh, you're running low on this, or maybe this has been in your fridge for a long time, which is what the METI project, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Japan was doing. It's recipes to help you use up the produce that's been in there maybe a little longer than it should be. So you start to eliminate the rest of that waste equation, which is actually in the home. Say that? Siri wanted to join in.
Yeah, that's okay. But Steve, when you were talking, I was thinking about the adoption process, and I know what that's like being, at a startup and doing something that's new. And to your point about the number of stakeholders that are involved in decision making, it's not always just one. There tends to be several. So if you even at a conference, somebody's like, hey, this is a great idea, I got to do it. But then you have to go through all these layers, and it takes time, and not all companies are as nimble as others. So I can totally relate to that. But I think that what's fun for me in my experience is that when it's the right thing and it's a good technology, that you start to see that adoption process accelerate as more and more people get exposed to it. So it sounds to me like this is something that is going to have a terrific adoption rate, because to me, it makes sense, because you talk about that idea of you could have things in your refrigerator, and your refrigerator is I guess in my world, I have one of those refrigerators with a digital screen. Wouldn't recommend it, by the way, but I have one. And if the refrigerator would you look at it and it would say hey, here's some recipes to help you consume what's in here, would be really cool, because it does give you recipes, but they're just oh, I got to go to the store to get that. And to move in that direction, I think it's probably exciting to a lot of people. I think for me, it certainly is. And can you talk about where you see this all headed in the future? I mean, you talked a little bit about, more direct engagement, but is there anything else that you see evolving as a result of this technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be big changes. It will be, if you think about where we are with online ordering. If you were going to a grocery retailer now and saying, online ordering is it's not a huge deal. It's less than 50% of the business. You should forget about that. I mean, that would never happen. Everyone accepts that they need to have an omni-channel online ordering strategy where you're starting to integrate these fulfillment mechanisms and so forth. And I really think that's where we're going with this. It's going to take a while, but I believe that the companies that adopt this will, if the board or the CEO says, look, we are moving towards a SaaS business model, and they are in the herbs and spices business. Well, first of all, people won't really understand how can you do that, but then you start thinking about, oh, well, I can take these food containers and they can know when they're empty and they can reorder themselves. And that means I can have a more intimate relationship with my customer, and the cost of customer acquisition goes down. I think it's similar to the way Amazon is shaking up the e-commerce world. I think there will be early adopters of this technology, and it will change their relationship with the consumer. And maybe not everyone wants to be the Netflix of herbs and spices or meat products or grocery products with their consumers. And I think plenty of us may decide that we want the old-fashioned fridge. But I do believe that, we'll go from a world where crates and pallets that are now 99% offline, they're in the dark, they'll suddenly be lit up. And everyone will think, can you remember the days when we had no idea where anything was? And how could we possibly run a supply chain like that? And so I think the new normal will be real-time visibility of everything all of the time, and not just where it is, but the state of it, the temperature of it, the fill level of the container. Is the crate empty? We've got a whole bunch of empty crates. Maybe we don't need as many crates. So I think what's going to happen first is there'll be low-level efficiencies. People will start to manage their pallet and crate pools better. And hopefully, we'll go from that to looking at what's in the crate and improving the shelf life and quality of that. And I think there'll be a virtuous circle on that. And then ultimately, my belief is that this will go direct to consumer, and we're seeing it already with these tags being put on delivery containers for chilled products that are going to people's homes. You live in San Diego, and I think if you live in New York or New Jersey, you get a home delivery of ice cream. The temperature, that's pretty important. And so I think one of the things we're starting to see is people wanting to put these devices in these reusable transport items, whether it's a pallet or a crate or a case or a cooler. And that's a kind of a fairly easy thing to get your head around. And then eventually it'll be, everything will be online. 90% of the things in your pantry and fridge will be connected. And it'll be a bit like what Amazon tried to do with the Amazon Dash button, where you kind of ran out of coffee and you pressed a button. But I think more and more of that packaging will reorder itself. And what I hope is we'll get back to the days of the milk bottle, and reusability will move, will come back, and more of the containers that we use in our home will be reusable, because the reverse logistics becomes simpler when everything's online. You're less worried about losing stuff, and that's another level where the sustainability can really improve as well.
I think that's really exciting to think about, that type of efficiency. I mean, maybe I think it scares some people because, they're always worried about Big Brother's going to know exactly where my can of peas is or something. But I think the efficiency gain is incredible, and the simplicity of just reordering it, right? How many times you're just like, oh, wait, we're out of steak sauce? Like, what? How did that happen? And somebody else used it, or, if you're like me and have a teenager, then things just disappear. And it's like, oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't tell anybody. So to have this automated I could see it being helpful. But how far away are we from something like that? I mean, that sounds like very futuristic to me, but you're obviously a lot closer to this than I am. What would you say I know predictions are hard to make, but just for where you sit, what are your thoughts on when are we going to see things really starting to move in that direction?
Well, the early adopters are doing it now, working on it now. The project with the Japanese government, that was just a trial. We had to put devices in the fridges that would read the things there. But I think the short answer is the next 5 years. I think you'll see that there'll be some folks that will, rather than waiting for the fridges and washing machines to all be connected seamlessly and automatically, you'll see appliances that will help read what's in the pantry and read what's in the kitchen. They may appear in the next 1 to 2 years. That there are customers of ours that are working on that. This stuff always takes longer than you would hope, but it doesn't take long for the first movers to get an advantage, on Wall Street, and for people to investors to see the potential. So, the big picture of what some companies are calling this is massive IoT. So there was IoT, the IoT of expensive things, and now especially the wireless carriers are calling what we just talked about massive IoT. And I think massive IoT is a phenomenon where we go from where we are today with a few tens of billions of things being online to where we see it going, which is 100 times bigger than that, where there are trillions of things online, everyday things, the food, the clothing, the medicine containers. And we haven't even talked about reminding people to take the medicine and all that stuff. I think that's it'll be a 10-year progression. So we will fully realize that massive IoT over 10 years. But, we're now, Shufersal is live. The largest retailer in Israel is live. We're doing projects with retailers in some of the largest retailers in the UK and the US, where they're starting to instrument the back of that supply chain, putting these tags on existing plastic crates. That's happening now. And we're making millions of these things, and they're going on everything from aerospace parts to zucchini crates. So that's happening now. But I think to fully realize its potential, we're talking about a decade. But I think there will be companies that appear and disappear as a result of either leaning into this or not leaning into this over the next 2 or 3 years.
Wow, that's really exciting, and I'm excited for that type of world because I think the efficiency gain is going to be incredible, and just to eliminate waste is super important, as well as the impact on the environment. So that's really, really cool. So Steve, we're at the point in the show where now you get to turn the tables. Now, normally it's really exciting for our guests because they get to be a podcaster and they're like, wow, I've never done this before. You are a podcaster, so it may not be as exciting for you, but is there anything that you'd like to ask me? I've been peppering you with questions, really interesting stuff, but if there's anything you want to ask or know about us, fire away.
Well, I have two questions. There's one question that we have on the Mr. Beacon podcast, which is the one that I've been doing for a few years now, which always strikes fear into the heart of every guest that comes onto the show, which is, what 3 songs would you take with you on a trip to Mars? If you could only take 3 songs, and why would you choose them? So that's like the really difficult one. And the easier one is, we've talked about this IoT technology. Where do you see the biggest opportunities? Where do you see the the shortest path? And I'm interested in where you think it'll be kind of a longer road to home. So you can forget about the music one if you like, but I am interested in what 3 songs you take.
Well, that's an interesting question. I've never been asked a question like that before. And immediately when you asked it, I started to say, well, I'm going to be going to Mars. So I probably wouldn't pick like 3 of the same artists because it'd probably get a little boring. I got to mix it up. So yeah. I would probably, so I grew up and my favorite band was Van Halen. That's a fun-filled fact. It's not really anymore, but it was. But it's very nostalgic for me, the David Lee Roth Van Halen. So I'd probably go with like Panama. That used to be like a really exciting thing. And then I would probably have to pick something a little bit more modern and a little bit like classical. So say maybe like some Vivaldi to like relax and just like, 4 seasons. And then maybe, I don't know, I would go with David Sheehan. What's his name? Ed Sheehan. That's the guy. He seems to be popular, making a lot of great music. One of his songs. I don't know, but that way I would have it's kind of spread out. Something that's more present, something from my childhood, and then something that kind of helped me relax. But
contemporary.
That's very good. Kind of what I think. As far as the Internet of Things, I think this is really exciting from container shipping industry, which is the bulk of my background, because it's been such a problem for people to get a good sense of like where my things are and how soon is it going to get here and why don't you know? And a lot of it is that there's just so many different vendors involved in getting a shipment from Shanghai to Chicago. There's just, there's terminals, rails, truckers, you name it, warehouses. So it's just, there's different stakeholders, and they all have different technical abilities to provide visibility. So what you find is that there's all these blind spots. And the ocean carrier side of the business where I come from, you could see the ship and you knew where your ship was. And that was always pretty easy. But that was only a part of the journey. That if you're going inland, or, that truckers have varying degrees of visibility. So you really wouldn't be able to see things like you would for other businesses. Like you order like an Amazon package and it says, your package is 3 stops away. And it's like, why do I not know where my container is, but I know my Amazon package is? So I think there's just a lot of opportunity, because I think in supply chain, there's so much difficulty in terms of like inventory planning and prioritizing, because you just don't know where things are. I hear this all the time. And by having a better visibility to where your things are, I think this type of technology, and whether, I could see for different businesses, there's a different level of granularity required. Like, do I need it on a container level? Do I need it on a package level? Do I need it on the individual bottle level? Like, those things make sense to me. And I think that, market forces will determine what's the most beneficial level of granularity. But to me, I think in shipping and supply chain, it is really something that's going to be really valuable, because it's a space that hasn't been invested in, and the technology is starting to evolve. But for a long time, it hasn't been where other industries are. And so I think that creates a lot of opportunity. So I think it's an exciting time.
That's great. You talked about granularity, and that's actually a metaphor that we've started using. We all have some level of visibility of the supply chain. It's not like it's completely in the dark, but I would argue that we've been working in this monochrome world, the 640 by 480 resolution, monochrome, very kind of infrequent updates of the image. And now you go to Costco and you see this like 4K screen, rich color, the refresh speeds. So everything is just fluid. And now we can't imagine, we just can't imagine looking at our TV in black and white and with that flickery screen. But you kind of have to see it. You have to have it stuck under your nose as you go past the greeter as you go in the store to really understand, oh, this is actually kind of cool. It's useful. I'm willing to pay a little bit more for more frequent visibility. And I don't want just one dimension, which is the black and white. I want the temperature information, has this product been opened information, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think it's a question of granularity, and there'll be some people who can run their businesses on basic standard definition, and others that will decide that for them they want to have the OLED screen full definition. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, so I think it was a very interesting discussion today. And for our listeners, if somebody wants to get a hold of you and find out more information, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, go to Wiliot.com. There's a ton of resources there. People can buy starter kits, so they can, just for a few $100s, they can play with the technology. And if you Google Mr. Beacon or go to mr-beacon.com, then I've been doing a podcast before I joined Wiliot, so it's like 7 years, interviewing people like you. So maybe you should come on the podcast. People from players like Cisco and Google to end users, Mall of America, and anyone that's interested in IoT that wants to learn a bit about who does what, then that's a good resource.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for sharing. And hey, if you want to ever have me on the show, I'm always available. So I love doing this. It's a lot of fun. So, well, thanks for coming on the show, Steve. And for our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, rate us, review us wherever you find our podcast, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download it. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.